Welcome to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor, and I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest right outside Portland, Oregon. And I've written a number of things. My most recent book is coming out hopefully soon. It's on artificial intelligence. But anyway, that's enough about me. Why don't we kick it over to you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology and Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Do some ministry work, writing, speaking, and a whole lot of other things.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I failed to mention that I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, and the reason I mention it is I think that this episode may come out the same week as the Touchstone Conference. So Glenn and I are going to be there, and we're going to be with Matthew Crawford and Jonathan Peugeot and Paul Kingsnorth. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be and we're hoping to maybe pin a couple of them down, and Glenn and I can actually have some interviews on site. But anyway, I'm still in some of your time here, Glenn. Why don't you go introduce yourself and then take us into the subject of the show?
I should also note that although she's not a speaker, Annie Crawford will be there as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, super.
So I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired and recovering history professor. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I've got my own ministry, East Branch Ministries at eastbranch.org. I'm writing increasingly for Substack and working on a book through teaching on my Patreon page through a series of things dealing with what right now dark enchantment, but what Christian re-enchantment should look like. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. And it is my show, and I wanted to start off with a quote from Lewis. I know that's kind of off norm for us, but Lewis said, and actually this I think appears in a couple of his works. He says, "For me, the natural organ of truth is reason, but the natural organ of meaning is imagination." So I wanted to explore that idea a little bit more, and I'm ultimately going to make an argument that we need to think about imagination as an element of epistemology. We usually think of epistemology primarily in terms of reason, but I think if Lewis is right here, and I suspect he is, then we actually have to incorporate imagination into our epistemology as well. So that's where we're going.
So, yeah. Let me just raise an observation or make an observation at this point. So imagination and truth for many people are incompatible. Like when somebody has an erroneous interpretation of, say, a text, someone might say, that's a very imaginative reading. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? But
that's only your imagination.
Right. But I think if we think about reality as such, so, truth and reality, I think, can be thought of as synonyms, those terms. But I think many people keep them pretty distinct. But I think if we think about imagination as apprehending reality, maybe it's a little less challenging for people to see how that could work.
And before you go, there is also a large suspicion in a lot of, especially the Reformed world, Calvin himself, the imagination being an idol-making factory. And so there's oftentimes a look at the imagination with a lot of suspicion that makes any claim to its significance problematic. Sorry.
Yeah, well, actually, Chris, you used a word there, apprehension. We're going to need to talk about that as we go along, too, because there's a difference between apprehension and comprehension.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I think we're going to need to be clear about that. But I want to start with Lewis's quote. And we'll start with reason is the natural organ of truth. Now, in Lewis's case, Lewis is coming into Christianity from a background as a rationalist. He had this odd combination. He was a rationalist, but also a romantic. But his romanticism didn't carry over into his understanding of truth, at least not initially. So when he says reason is the natural organ of truth, I think he's got a very narrow definition of truth that he's using here. I think what he's saying is that what reason can do is give us facts. It's a term I would prefer to truth here. I think that's what he's getting at. And by reason, I suspect Lewis is talking about not just simply logic, but also inductive reasoning, all of those kinds of things. That is that's the way you find facts about the world. And I think he's using truth in a very limited sense there. And when he goes on to say imagination is the organ of meaning, he's pointing to a weakness in rationalism. Rationalism can only give us facts. It can't tell us what those facts mean. And so for that, you need imagination. Now, we need to define what imagination is. In classical terms, imagination is the ability to create images in your mind. Okay. It's really, that's the classical definition of it. Now, we need to extend that a little bit further because Lewis goes on when he says that imagination is the natural organ of meaning. He goes on to say that you need imagination even before reason, because in order to make sense of the things that you are seeing, you are experiencing, in order to make sense of any of that, you need imagination. Because the experiences that we have, this is my expansion on it, the experiences that we have are not self-interpreting. So you need your imagination to give you a sort of intuitive sense or an apprehension of what those experiences you have mean. And only once you do that can you move to the next step of drawing conclusions and facts and things like that. So even the very raw material of reason depends on you understanding the meaning of what you've got, and that requires imagination because facts are not self-interpreting, or experiences are not self-interpreting.
And I think it's important to note why this is also significant for Lewis himself. I mean, Lewis is a person of stories. And the thing about stories is they had been brushed off under this narrow interpretation of reason as fact. So everything that had to do with the storied world, with narrative, myths, and all of this had been basically left out of the picture. And so nothing more than sort of subjective expressions for kind of disclosing something. And so this push towards a fuller understanding of the way we know and relate to reality is a way of showing how significant the inclusion of narrative, story, and symbol are to proper understanding of truth.
Yeah, I think something else that comes to mind, I've mentioned this before, I believe, when I was a student just learning, how to interpret Scripture, I favored the writings of Paul, and the more abstract, the better. So Romans, of course, Galatians, and kind of was, condescending toward the Psalms, even toward narrative generally in Scripture. And I thought that even parables were just ways to make difficult concepts accessible to uneducated people, right? Yeah. Now, if you read the Scriptures, if you read the Gospels, that's exactly the opposite of what Jesus was up to.
It's flip. Exactly.
But I still run across people who think about parables that way. That the only reason why you would ever resort to a story is because simple people can't relate to, abstract reasoning, and consequently, we have to do that for them. But what you're getting at, Glenn, is completely different than that.
Right. And it's worth noting, I think, that the idea that we go to Paul's epistles is somewhat characteristic of the Reformed world. I've run into people who would say that they would much rather preach on one of Paul's epistles than one of the Gospels.
Yeah, that's so weird.
And the thing is, we talk about the lordship of Christ. We talk about him as our Savior. We talk about him as prophet, priest, and king, and all of those sorts of things. And yet somehow there's a tendency to downplay in many circles the actual accounts of his life. We would rather hear from Paul about Jesus's life than from one of the eyewitnesses.
That's right. Or even Jesus.
Or even Jesus. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's illustrative of this. And this actually, I hadn't planned on going here quite this early, but this actually brings up another thing that Lewis talks about in connection with myth. Lewis believed that the significance of myth was that it provided you with a bridge between the world as we can experience it and comprehend it, and, well, comprehend, not apprehend, comprehend it, understand it through reason and all of those sorts of things, and reality. Reality was not, to Lewis, something that was directly accessible to us through pure reasoning faculties. And in fact, we need myth in order to connect us, to connect our experience, to connect our understanding to deeper realities. And as a result, good myths, or all true myths, are subject to multiple kinds of interpretations and things like that, but they all point ultimately toward reality. Now, it does indicate that there are good myths and there are bad myths. I mean, so there are limitations here. But this understanding of myth actually connects in with something Tolkien said. He said, and I quote, "After all, I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. And long ago, certain truths and modes of this kind were discovered and must always reappear." So here, Tolkien is really speaking to what Lewis is, where he talks about myth, which is going to be imaginative ultimately, connecting our knowledge, our comprehension of the world with true reality.
Yeah.
And Tolkien isn't shy about using the word truth to describe that process.
Right.
Lewis, like I said, has this much more limited understanding, or this much more limited definition of what truth is in the quote we started with. Tolkien is not shy about saying, no, this includes these things that we apprehend much more intuitively or imaginatively.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like Lewis is kind of playing to what most people would have thought of in that the environment he was in, and he's building with it. I mean, you think of the mechanistic world in which, when you're dealing with what they would call fact, is almost the self-interpreting fact, that it's obvious if you have the right set of scientific tools and rational kind of analysis to get a hold of the scientific or the material, the mechanical understanding of something. But it definitely stripped the world of meaning, and it completely eradicated the way in which intelligible form and the meaning and purpose were built into things. And it becomes very reductionistic. But what is going on here, it's almost as if, and you see this a lot later, is that even figures like Lewis, they don't only contribute to retrieving the proper sense of imagination, but they're also telling us basically that you can't read the natural world or natural philosophy either properly unless you have this in place. This is kind of the meeting point at which you are apprehending what is really there in nature the right way.
Yeah, let me comment on something here that this brings to mind. One of the discoveries that I stumbled across in the course of my research on artificial intelligence is something Geoffrey Hinton said. Geoffrey Hinton is considered one of the godfathers of artificial intelligence. And he said that about 20 to 30 years ago, there were two schools of thought on the development of artificial intelligence. One was the logic school, and the other was the neural network school. And of the two, the neural network school was the kind of the freaky fringe bunch. So the idea was that artificial intelligence would come about through essentially really comprehensive programming that works in much in a way that's drawing on syllogisms and things like that, and it very rote. But what the neural network approach promoted was the idea that we ought to create software that mimics the human brain, and neural networks form through an encounter with reality, with the physical world. And this is what they're also discovering with regard to what they refer to as embodied AI or robotics. You teach a robot to walk, not by making a perfect program for walking, but actually giving it a neural net and trying and encouraging it to try. And then as it does it, the neural networks, in other words, the connections are made. So what I'm getting at is that there is an apprehension of reality. There's now there's no comprehension.
That's right.
But there's an apprehension of reality in the sense that it's by the interacting with this larger reality outside yourself that your own ability to think and imagine comes about.
It's
not limited to the physical world, by the way.
Yeah.
So it goes beyond that. But you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and it's thinking back with the notion, Glenn, that you had mentioned about the way Lewis does kind of talk sometimes as though that is a category, truth that is a little bit distinct, truth and reason from the other, because he does. You remember the essay on historicism that Lewis writes. And he goes to task about historicism as trying to import a meaning from the facts of history. He doesn't like these kind of genealogies of meaning. He says if you're dealing with history in the way you should be dealing with this happened, then this had this kind of cause. And you're almost talking about that too, the kind of mechanical notion of that relationship. But he didn't like taking it to historicism, which started to almost be able to reveal out the meaning of those events. Not that there isn't a place to do that, but he wasn't going to give it to historicism. It's narrative, story, literature. It's these different things with the imagination is much more significant that he puts in that place. So yeah, maybe that's where he would have run up. I don't know enough about the history of his relationship with Tolkien to know if that would have been interpretive conflict point.
Yeah, I'm not. I think you hit on something that you said earlier that's important. That Lewis, when he talks about truth, is probably speaking the language of his own environment at the time. He does take the next step and say that imagination is even necessary to derive truth, because you need imagination to understand, to give meaning to the experience that you have. Because if you don't have imagination, if you don't give it meaning, all you are left with is literally nonsense.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's not clear to me whether Lewis entirely bought the definition of truth he was using there.
Yeah.
Again, it may have just been, he's an expert at communication. It may just have been, this is how people think of truth. Okay, so this is how I'm going to approach it here. But even there, he's beginning to sneak in imagination as foundational, even for that understanding of truth.
This reminds me of something that Einstein said concerning imagination and scientific discovery. I don't have the quote, but paraphrasing it from memory, it's something along the lines of imagination being more important because it more or less is a place where you can see certain possibilities that you can investigate. So it's still, it's not what we're getting at. It's not meaning. Yeah. But it has this important functions even for a scientist.
Well, Einstein actually wrote a book explaining relativity to high school age students, and it was all based on imaginative pictures. A lot of them involving trains.
Right, I remember that.
And so he is using his imagination as a way of, and actually, I think his methodology involved using imagination.
Yeah, I think that's right.
If I remember right, one of the things that he tried to imagine is, all right, what would happen if I was actually traveling at the speed of light? How would that work? What would be the consequences of that? So he's using these imaginative exercises as ways to try to think through the science, and then he'll work on the mathematics and all of that with it. And then he uses imagination. He uses images, stories, pictures, word pictures, in order to communicate this and explain it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, and this is, I mean, when you think of Christian ways of trying to think about creation, and you think of, we've talked a lot about form and purpose, but think of form even more theologically rich, that there is a kind of word stamp from the Logos onto things, and that is dealing with wholes rather than broken down parts separated from each other. And the way in which our ability to comprehend and apprehend and pull out the kind of meaning relationships that those have are unquestionably bound up with our imaginative capacity, pushing beyond just that kind of surface look at material relationships. Material relationships can take us far. I mean, Chris was just telling us about it. They can take us very far, but this is they can't go in. I remember, I think it was David Schindler who talked about the way in which the human being, as in spirit, a spirited soul, embodied soul, and the way in which imagination is basically in which the material world becomes a spiritual home in us, and vice versa, the way in which our spiritual natures kind of incarnate our faith into the world. And so that meaning relationship is essential to our reading and relating to created things in light of their created meaning and purpose, and also what we can do with them in a way that is generous and healthy rather than destructive and harmful. And I think Tolkien, if anyone, had this attention on what's harmful when you don't get that right.
Well, I think, there's kind of an intuition that sometimes just salt of the earth people have, like Sam in Lord of the Rings, if we're going to stay with Tolkien.
Yeah.
I mean, Sam,
Always a good idea.
Sam Wise. No, I think there's a wisdom that Sam possessed, and we see it right from the start. Yeah. And it's really kind of founded in humility, right? He doesn't have any illusions about himself.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's grounded. I mean, he's a gardener. There's so many marvelous things about Sam, but you can contrast him with, say, Saruman or Sauron. Those characters really are fools, even though intellectually they dwarf Sam in terms of their knowledge.
Yeah. So let's talk about the difference between comprehension and apprehension. We've been kicking around the words. We should probably do some definitions here. When you comprehend something, you understand it. And this would be through reason. In Lewis's terminology, this would be through reason. Apprehension is something a little bit different. When you apprehend something, well, think about apprehending a person. What are you doing? You're catching them. You're grasping them. So apprehension as an intellectual category refers to, I can't escape the word, almost intuitive way where we just sort of grasp things. We just suddenly get this realization, this understanding. We don't reason our way to it. It's just something that happens and we grasp it. So I think that distinction ends up being important here, particularly because imagination operates at the level of apprehension, not comprehension.
Yeah.
Right.
So making sure we understand that, and the terminology we've been kicking around here, I think would be helpful at this point.
Going back to the definition of imagination as image making, there's obvious problems with image making with regard to idolatry. There's certain things we're not supposed to image.
Well, and actually, I think when Calvin talks about imagination being an idol-making factory, he's going back to root words.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. At the same time, there's no escaping imagination. I guess that's the other thing. This idea that we could live without imagination is just absurd. Just to get through the day. Yeah. I mean, we have to just like when we're sitting at our desk in the morning and we're trying to think through what we want to get done in a day, and we make a to-do list. We're imagining the course of the day and imagining our tasks and thinking about how much time they'll take. I mean, in other words, even at this most pedestrian level, there's no life without imagination.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And this raises, okay, this raises a question that I think is going to be somewhat controversial. That's nothing new for us. Is when we think of epistemology, the branch of philosophy that deals with truth and knowledge, we usually think of epistemology in terms of induction and deduction, reason and rational thinking and experience. Maybe we include abduction, which is inference to best explanation. All of these are very intellectual kinds of activities. Induction, deduction, abduction. Okay, great. Should we include imagination as a category within epistemology? And I would argue the answer is yes. But I think that this is not something that people who deal with epistemology would regularly agree to.
Yeah, I think that's right. The exceptions, I mentioned a couple before the show began. There's Coleridge. He was a believer in the very thing we're talking about. And then George MacDonald, his famous, I think, is it a series of essays or an essay itself? A Dish of Warts. I don't know if either of you have read that. I'm not familiar with that. But he's stepping out of story mode, which is where we normally see him, and he's thinking about making stories. And so A Dish of Warts is his exploration of this very thing we're getting at, which is, here's a guy too who's Scott, and is in this super reformed world, mm-hmm. And I know that he started to dabble in some things that we were uncomfortable with, but nevertheless, he had a rich imagination, and he didn't see a contradiction between what he was doing with storytelling and what he had been called to do as a pastor. And I think that's important to think about. I think about that a lot, since that's where I spend my time.
And it's interesting that the classic ways of thinking about philosophy and theology, the way Christianity took up the Hellenic tradition and kind of converted it, was that even philosophy and philosophical knowing was bound up with spiritual exercises about the purification of vision and the capacity to see. And education, discipleship is about the art of converting. That is what we're doing here. And so even the kind of knowledge, when we're talking theology proper, doctrine of God, it is not first about getting your statements right. It is first about the encounter with the statements and the encounter with reality are bound up. And so it is very much this way of knowing. Of course, they took over contemplation, which is an intuitive way of following the scriptural reality to where it leads. And this is where I guess Calvin would rightfully say, because we're not dealing with a strictly materially embedded meaning when we're referring to deity, any kind of materially embedded meaning could not possibly capture something like God. But the flip side, the incarnation, which I think is the groundwork for us, our entrance in, does require us to deal with embedded meaning in this world, which is a human being who is also divine. And that sets the table for a different way in which a Christian understanding of spiritual transformation has to deal with also the tangible, the created world, the personal and the interpersonal, the communal, the family, the social, all those things which are bound up with not just biology and material, but also embedded meaning, which is highly symbolic and it can't be captured by just sort of talking about efficient causes, what physical thing caused this physical thing.
Right. This brings to mind debates that sometimes I'm privy to at a examination at Presbytery for licensure or something, with regard to people who are, moving toward men who are moving toward ordination as teaching elders. And we get into the images, and sometimes we get into some crazy conversations about whether or not it's okay to imagine Jesus when you're hearing a gospel story. I'm like, well, how do you not? Even if we took your your extreme interpretation of the prohibition of images to heart. What do you do with the fact that our minds immediately go to this? When we hear him, being described as breaking the bread, or why I see a guy breaking bread. Do I have to repent of that when it comes to mind? But related to imagination too is not just the visual.
Mm-hmm.
It's the oral. It's the other senses. Yeah. I think particularly evocative is the sense of smell. I can almost smell and taste things imaginatively.
Yeah.
Maybe some people are more imaginative in the sense that they have a wider range and a richer experience when it comes to the imagination. Maybe it's something that gets developed over time. But, even in my dreams, that's another crazy thing to think about dreams. When you think about imagination, you're asleep and there are all these images. I mean, last night was just so full of dreams for me. I woke up several times in the course of the night, not because I needed to, but because the image I just saw was so striking, and then I would fall right back to sleep. And then you get the crazy
the image.
Yeah, that's right. Then you get that a crazy experience where you forget everything. Although there are some dreams that have stuck with me my entire life.
Yeah.
I've had dreams where they weren't recurring, but they were so powerful that I couldn't forget them. And I wondered whether or not they were more meaningful for that. Maybe that's one way to think about. No, I'm not encouraging people to try to, do anything crazy like live their lives by, visions and dreams. But we do have dreams in Scripture, after all, right? Mm-hmm. And they were a means that God used to communicate with people.
Well, and you can also see the way sometimes you wake up in the middle of it and it's still happening a little bit, and you see the way that your brain is processing meaning and making these connections. It does it the kind of narrative it puts together is, of course, bizarre when you look at it.
That's the thing about it. They're so imaginative. I guess that's what got me into it. They're so imaginative that even if I'm awake, I would never have come up with that.
Well, then there's also the phenomenon of when you've got a problem, you sleep on it, and you wake up in the morning with the solution. It's because your mind has worked on it overnight. Your subconscious doesn't sleep.
Right.
But going back to the issue of epistemology, I think the objection that a lot of people would have about arguing that imagination belongs in the category of epistemology because it is a route to truth. I think that the objection that they're going to raise is there something like there are no controls on it. How do you know that what you're imagining is correct? Your imagination can lead you into all kinds of crazy and bizarre areas. So what do we do with that? How would you solve that problem?
Well, it's an integral reality. It's not something that it can be by itself. I mean, that's how we deal with all of it. I mean, reason by itself does dangerous things, right?
Exactly.
Luther gave us that. It could become the devil's mistress very quickly. So reason by itself, faith without reason kind of can end up in all kinds of strange places as well. So it becomes an integral reality in relating to the other things the right way. And I think even, Calvin's point, if your mind and your knowledge and your knowing and your ways of imagining not governed by Scripture for a Christian in scriptural modes, then they risk going into territory that can't be contained. And that will always lead to places of kind of what we would call today self-fulfilling prophecies and everything else. I mean, we automatically become somehow the center of, a bit down the road of where that ends up. I mean, look at most of your cult leaders. I mean, where does that end up? They become kind of the reference point for that.
So, related to this is the need to train our imaginations. So giving our children and even adults good stories.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do we evaluate them? I think that there are canonical stories. I mean, it's easy to identify, like the prodigal son, or even like the Iliad. Those are canonical stories. And And so those are the stories that should inform our imaginations and give us things to think about, mull over, and maybe provide a template for evaluating our imaginative work. I also think it's interesting that when we failed to do that, we use imagination almost predictably in bad ways. So think about what we have with the transhumanist craziness that's going on right now.
Yeah.
So what we have are a lot of very bright technicians who have my thinking is emaciated imaginative lives. Yeah. And so they don't know the canonical stories.
No.
They've at least not taken them to heart.
Well, I actually want to add one thing to knowing the canonical stories. One of the things that we are really, really bad at is understanding how to understand a story. Yeah. Someone in one of the most damning book reviews I ever ran into, someone said that the fact that the Penguin translation of the Odyssey sold 1 million copies is a sign that modern readers read for the plot.
Yeah.
See, but that's the problem. Modern readers read for the plot. They want to know what happened. They don't know how to ask the question, what does this mean?
Right.
Because we are stuck in a lot of ways in a world of reason. There was, I think it was Xenophon, said he ran into someone in Athens whose father told him that knowing Homer would make him a better man, and so he memorized the entire Iliad and Odyssey. How does that story make you a better man? You have to search for meaning in it. You've got to ask questions. You've got to think about it. You got to exercise your imagination in order to draw the actual meaning of the story out of the plot.
The key right there is the embedded meaning, and the classic ways of educating. This is what I was on to earlier with philosophy. Is art of conversion. It isn't. This is different than conversion of the soul to God. This is still converting of the soul to embedded meaning in the creation. And so this is something that allows you to have a relationship to reality in fuller ways, even if it isn't salvific. And if you are a Christian, it just enhances the capacity to see reality because there is embedded meaning. And these stories are connected to people who have encountered that and put that as creatures into storied form for a significant purpose of communicating that embedded meaning. And it's a world of educating the soul that is going on there with embedded meaning, which is God's meaning implanted in creation. So even if we can't get a full picture of it, not even as Christians, because we continuously need sanctification, it is something we should understand and know, especially in light of Christ, who says to basically bring Christ to bear on all things. And but there is this. I think this thing is that there is an art of conversion that is going on in classical ways of educating. And as you're participating in that story the right way, you are dealing with the embedded meaning, which is impacting, guiding, directing in ways that creaturely meaning is supposed to, be shared by humans.
So your mention of the Odyssey, Glenn, got me thinking about a recent article. I can't recall who wrote it, in which the challenge of, say, social media and artificial intelligence is likened to the Lotus Eaters episode. And, what you have here is this ancient story, which is powerfully, I think, illuminating when it comes to how technology is affecting us. You got the same problem as Odysseus and his men faced with that episode.
Right. Yeah, I mean, think about it like this. Well, first of all, if story and imagination isn't a road to truth, why did Jesus tell parables?
Right.
Okay, and the parables are all stories. And we know that when we look at a parable, we've got to interpret it. We've got to find, all right, what did Jesus mean when he told this story? That's a question we naturally ask. But somehow we don't think to ask it for other stories.
Well, that I think is right on the money. And it gets you to want to wonder, why not? Why don't we carry that over? What's going on? I think for many people, parables aren't really stories in the same sense that, say, the Odyssey is. Obviously, the subject matter and the person who's telling the story, those things are really important. But the idea that there would be any overlap strikes some people as almost blasphemous. That you could categorize, that you could put these into the same category, stories, and you could draw meaning from them. And for many people, parables, yes, but Odyssey, we shouldn't even read that.
Yeah.
Well, I took 3 years of Greek in college, and my absolute favorite thing in Greek to read in Greek. I mean, I did the Medea, I did all of these other things, but my favorite thing to read was Homer.
Yeah.
I loved Homeric Greek, and some of my this is kind of weird, but some of my fondest memories academically at Michigan State was lying on my stomach in the horticultural gardens translating Homer. I probably shouldn't admit that publicly, but
that was an indicator that you were called to the academy there.
Yeah, probably. And Michigan State, by the way, has now eliminated that garden. So
I thought you were going to say eliminated the reading
going on.
Well, I thought you were going to say eliminating the study of Greek or Homer.
That may have happened too. I don't know. But stories have meanings. Good stories have meanings. Some stories are just the plot, but a good story, these great stories, fairy tales, folk tales, the Iliad, the Odyssey, mythology, all of these have meaning beyond just the plot. Somebody who's really good at this, by the way, is Martin Shaw, who I would love to get on the podcast sometime, but I have no idea how I can pull that one off. But Martin Shaw is a storyteller in England, and he's considered one of the truly great storytellers of our era. He's also a mythologist. And when he does a story, one of the things he does is try to encourage people to think about what it means, how it speaks into their lives. And that's not something we typically do. So when we talk about teaching these things, one of the things that we actually need to do, I think, is to teach people how to truly encounter a story.
Well, I think we've talked about, hermeneutics when it comes to this, interpreting stories, or just hermeneutics generally speaking, in terms of the four modes, the literal and so forth, the allegorical. I think for most folks, once you get past the literal and the allegorical, they don't have anything else to bring to the table when it comes to thinking about a story. So if it's not an allegory, in other words, they don't think it has any meaning at all, and it's merely entertainment.
Right.
I think a lot of folks think, and I knew that was true for me for the longest time. And it was only when I, started to think about stories in a serious way that I could get a sense that there's a lot more going on. I think that's one of the things that Tolkien was pushing against when he said the things he said about allegory, because there were people who insisted that what he was up to was allegory, and he was, no, that's not it. But I wouldn't say that he would say it's merely entertainment either. It's a rich, set of stories.
It's a participatory vision of reality, but it isn't one necessarily that uses that kind of that allegorical hierarchy. Some could say it's a kind of variation of the way that Thomas, Aquinas deals with that thing, but implanted into a story. So it looks, in many ways, like familiar reality, which Aquinas would always say is that first sense. The literal sense in the classic way of defining is participatory. It's not the way we define it in a materialistic, cause and effect reconstructed world. It's one in which the kind of ordinary everyday is our step into it. And he keeps a lot of it there, whereas someone like Lewis will bring a lot of that rich symbolism to bear right in the ordinary everyday. And that's his way of kind of dealing with participation and with a bit of a different emphasis.
Well, let's think a little bit about the anagogical approach. Because when we think typologically, this is something that you can actually talk to Reformed people about, because they think they can see, types of Christ in the Old Testament, and you can say, well, okay, that's an anagogical way of interpreting, stories in the Old Testament or Old Testament passages. That can be applied to other texts, maybe not in the same, you're not looking for Christ necessarily, although that's not a bad thing to do sometimes if you're working with certain kinds of texts, like even the Lord of the Rings. But if you're just trying to look for meaning without resorting to the moral and the allegorical, if you're looking for patterns, if you're looking for things that remind you of other things that are addressing perhaps certain themes and are being even hinted at symbolically. So if we think about Chronicles of Narnia, and the fact that, if we're on the same page with Michael Ward, and I am, if you think about each of the books, the planets and their various symbols are woven into those stories, so that there's a kind of mood or tone that the story has. So if I think about the contrast, say, between the Silver Chair and Voyage of the Dawn Treader, dramatically different moods.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, one is the moon and the other is the sun, and suddenly it starts to make sense.
Yeah. So back to the epistemological thing. The argument that imagination can easily leads us astray because people think of imagination as untethered to any kind of reality. And I think that's a mistake, particularly in the idea of having, for a Christian, a sanctified imagination. But the other point is that, as Tom pointed out, that reason can lead us astray too.
Absolutely.
There have been people, through the centuries, we see one set of ideas that's discarded in favor of another, in favor of another, in favor of another, and every one of those sets of ideas was reached through reason, and yet they get discarded as false, as wrong. So the argument that imagination can lead you astray, it applies equally to reason being able to lead you astray, and we've got a long history of that.
Yeah.
Right.
But what we need then, I think Chris said this, what we need then is imagination that's tethered to reality by connecting it to reason and having them work together as a way of comprehending and apprehending the world and reality.
Right.
And I think with that point, I think when we're talking about it as a divinely endowed creative capacity, right? Because this is really where everybody's getting up in arms and the big shift. I mean, everything from Vico to the modern world, the big shift was the recognition that human beings are creative and creators. They're homo faber. They make things. They do things, and they have a part in that, and that is a good thing to recognize. The question is, what do you do with it? Well, with Vico, for example, that you have a different interpretation than, say, Kant or Descartes or Hobbes or the modern world. Or Bacon, for example. But take Vico. What he does is he takes the classic view of the pause before the gift of reality that we need to take before we make. And he's talking, he's not necessarily saying in a temporal sense. He's saying kind of in a noetic or in a knowledge sense, but also a relationship to things sense. So recognizing there is an embedded meaning, that we're a part of it, and we don't get to do what we want, is the first step before we put our creative agency to work, including our imagination. But we can't help but be creative and imaginative because that's part of our being made in the image of God. And so how we do that matters. Now, this wouldn't have been a question for Calvin because that focus on the human being as active in that way really wasn't the same discussion point it became later with these figures, and especially with the later Renaissance. And you could probably talk on that more. But I think a lot of people fear that creative element is trying oftentimes in the work we do to bring a merely human constructed twist of meaning onto something, a fabricated meaning rather than an embedded one.
Right.
That is what we're supposed to. We're supposed to be, in many ways, taking, of course, the spiritual with the work we do and bringing it to bear on our relationship to the material in ways that values the material creation as a gift.
So we're each involved in artistic work. You guys are musical. I've got my work I'm doing with like illustrations and stuff like that. I don't know how they compare, but when it comes to, say, the imaginative work that I'm engaged in with, say, a children's story, and that I'm illustrating, I'll go through, I'm not exaggerating, a dozen drawings before I capture what I'm after.
Yeah.
So, but that means that I kind of had a sense of what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Now, maybe a real master would get their first draft. Maybe Michelangelo wouldn't require 12 drawings.
But if you notice most of their work, it is just sketches and sketches and sketches of just
Right.
drawing little things like the fingernail over and over and over again. So
and in that process, and this gets back to something we talked about before with creativity and artificial intelligence. I need to step back and let some time go by before I revisit the work, and almost without fail, something that I thought was passable, I come back 24 hours later, I say, no, that's not going to work. That's not what I was after, that kind of thing. So in a sense, I know, but I don't.
Yeah.
If you get my drift, and it's almost like a discovery process.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, a bad reading of the modern world is just you doing the latter. You act like by just doing, and that there isn't a kind of conflict going on. Whereas I would argue that conflict's the healthy way, because you're pausing before something you intuit that is bound up with something that you are a reality you're honing in on, and also having a hand in shaping.
Mm-hmm.
So it is almost like you're having an antenna for that creative reality that is inspiring you,
Mm-hmm.
and its relationship to what you're going to do, and that is drawing a certain kind of limit. And this can sound very abstract, but when you do art, you kind of get what you're talking about. It's similar with music, and especially the side of composing. Playing is a little bit different, because it just you practice, you drill, you practice. You still need a relationship. As a matter of fact, that's where you really see the relationship between the tangible and the embedded, and your relationship to it. But on the compositional side, it can be rigorous. But then you do see these people who almost hear things in full, and you'd think they're almost transcribing, but it really has their stamp on it. It's phenomenal. What are they honing in on?
Yeah. Well, that's where I know, we've got some reservations about using the term genius, but I do think that there are people like that.
Yeah.
That just have that gift. Obviously Mozart, which the film Amadeus explores a little bit. I know they're having some artistic licenses being.
Yeah.
But it is getting at something.
Yeah.
Salieri didn't. Yeah. Salieri didn't have it, but he knew Mozart did, and he also believed that Mozart didn't deserve it.
That's right.
He's probably right.
At least,
but that's another thing about this. This whole thing is it doesn't have. Maybe this is one of the reasons why some people, particularly people who are pious, are kind of appalled at the gifts that some people who are not pious possess.
Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting thing Ken Boa talked about in one of his books. I think it's called Life in the Presence of God. I think that's the one that he talked about this. He said, he talked about savants. And he mentions one guy that I've actually seen on videos, who you can fly him in an airplane over a city once, and then he can sit down and draw exactly down to the window everything in that city. Just from looking out the window of the airplane. Other people who are, completely mathematical geniuses and all of these sorts of things. And he says, most of these guys aren't well-rounded people.
That's right.
Okay. But
some of them are just plain jerks.
But what he says is, when you look at a savant, Ken's point was, this is what somebody who has unbounded capacity in one area looks like. This is what the human being is capable of. And he says that, his point is that when we look at eternity, when we look at the resurrection life, those savants tell us something about what that resurrection life is going to be like. We are going to be unbounded in our abilities, in terms of our perception, in terms of our skill, in terms of our knowledge, in terms of our memory, in terms of our imagination, I would add, all of these kinds of things. This is what we are looking at in eternity. And these geniuses that you're talking about in music or in these other areas are another example of that. I have all kinds of music in my head that I cannot transcribe. I do not have the skill to transcribe and orchestrate it properly. I just don't have it.
That's an important thing to consider. And so when is it just the fact that you just need to develop your skills more to be able to make that happen? And when is it just the fact that maybe it just can't happen?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And what do you do with the fact that you've got a finite amount of time? I'm never going to be a great composer.
Right.
And, I just had another birthday. I'm not getting any younger. I don't have time.
Right. So this gets me thinking about
taken care of.
Yeah, this gets me thinking about transhumanism again, and the fact that really the first transhumanists were the Christians because of our hope in the resurrection. The very thing you're getting at with Ken and his observations. I've thought it would make an interesting book introducing Christianity with the title "The First Transhumanists."
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because there is a little bit of a nuance there, as you know, that there is, because there are two kinds of threads in Christian thought. I mean, the one thing that gets left out of course, secular transhumanism and some types of modern Christian transhumanism is they have a much more horizontal and futuristic notion. As almost a historicist way of understanding the relationship of the transcendent to the temporal time that we're in now versus the vertical of kind of classical. And so both elements are there, and they do need to be related. But when one gets bracketed out, you could see how the Christian transhumanists in the historicist sense could get flattened into the same projects.
And we actually see that with certain people who call themselves Christian transhumanists, who actually believe that these new technologies are the means by which we're going to
enter. Talk about imagination.
Immanentizing the eschaton.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in any event, I still want to make the argument that imagination, sanctified imagination particularly, but imagination is a valid branch of epistemology. And I would argue, by the way, this is a whole nother thing, that there are different, just as there are different branches of reason, induction, deduction, abduction, for example, I would argue that there are different branches of the imagination. So we can talk about a poetic imagination, a mythic imagination, others as well. But that would be a whole different kind of thing to explore.
But that would make a great study, though. I mean, Glenn, as just you mentioned it, I think that, the verbal, the musical, the visual, the tactile, all these things are different ways of seeing the imagination express itself.
Right. Yeah. And I'm thinking of it as well, primarily in Lewis's term that imagination is the organ of meaning.
Right.
So that's why we go first to poetry, to mythology, to those sorts of things, to story. We could, there are lots of others as well. And then there's the practical application of imagination in the world. So those kinds of things that you're talking about. But I think that this is something that's worth thinking about a lot more and worth considering, because especially in the world that we're in now, where logic, where reason, where all of these things have lost the place that they were holding in Lewis's day. people no longer really trust logic. They no longer trust reason. They no longer trust anything. They don't trust language because they think it's a tool for manipulation. All of these kinds of things. I think it's worth really exploring and digging into the use of imagination as a route to truth. Because I think it will be a lot, again, I've said this kind of thing before, I think it'll be a lot more powerful as a way of reaching people and actually connecting them into the truth if used appropriately.
Right. Well, that's great. Thanks, Glenn, for making this a subject of conversation today. It got me thinking. Anyway, anything you want to say, Tom, as we wrap up?
No, it just got me thinking of also how significant it is tied to being persons and the personal. That has a lot going on now, especially in this world of AI and everything else, where a lot of things, roles can be mimicked, but the personal is going to take on heightened significance, and the relation of imagination and human meaning is going to play, I think, a central role in the way we reconnect with each other as human beings in the coming future.
Yeah. Well, good stuff. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. And if you like what we do, we could use some help. We could use your help to pay the bills. And the way you can do that is through our Patreon account. There's a link in the show notes if you want to go there and explore a bit and find and learn about all the different things that you can do to help us out. We'd appreciate that. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.